Welcome, everyone. This is Roose's Book Club, and we are here live in the studio. I'm Simbrit Smith, and I'm here with my host.
I'm Ryan Robinson, Parent Chief. I am the founder and director of Future Leaders Bermuda, which is the organization behind Roose's Book Club. Simbrit, tell us who you are.
And I am the social media manager and co-founder of Roose's Book Club. And we're here today, we're here every other week, to talk about, like we said, nation building. We're going to talk about community building, and we want to talk about empowerment. So, Ryan, how did we get here? Do you tell our story?
The theme of today is, how did we get here? So we're saying welcome to all of our listeners. We're encouraging you to participate. This is our first show, Roose's Book Club, here live at Hott 107.5. Let's talk a little bit about Roose's Book Club. If you're tuning in and you're hearing the word book club, don't be turned off by it. We're not just going to be reading. It's not just for persons who are avid readers. This is a community that we're building here, and we're happy to launch it with you today. So, Sam, let's talk a little bit about what Roose's Book Club is. How did we get here as a club? And in the wider context, how did we get here as a society? We're going to be talking a little bit about why we're launching this now, why we think it's important, why the community needs this, and the state that we're in today as a community and as a country. Let's get a bit into the origins of the club, Sam.
So we started back in 2020 during the pandemic, and we were all watching what happened with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it really came out of this desire of young Bermudians to understand our history better, to understand the issues that we were having in our community here in Bermuda, and how they related in the wider context of what was going on globally. So we started to talk. It started on Twitter. Mm-hmm. We had some dialogue, and we decided that we wanted to come more from like a place of education. Mm-hmm. So, right.
So, if you think back to 2020, we were in the pandemic lockdown. Mm-hmm. You had Black Lives Matter. There was this massive movement. And we had already been talking on Instagram and on social media a while around politics, around community, around the things that we wanted to see as a country, as young Bermudians. But there was a cry out for a little bit more, because what we think is there are a lot of Bermudians out there that care about the community, they're concerned about the future of our island, and they just don't really know what to do. I think that stems a lot from the generational gap. There are a lot of young Bermudians out there that feel like they don't know their history. We don't really understand our community. And so Roose's Book Club was formed from young Bermudians saying, we want to discuss community issues, but from a place of an informed perspective, from a place of understanding our history. And so in 2020, we got a group together, and we sat down with some elders. And essentially, I asked them, if you had to put together a list of books for people who don't want to read, just the bare minimum, something that will help us understand our community, our society, us as a people. What does that list look like? Just the bare essentials. And so we crafted a curriculum of books. Now, soon after in that year, the world opened back up. That list, dwindled. But we ended up with Simbrit Smith, myself, and Ciara Burrows. And it ended up being three of us. And we sat and we went through these books. Mm-hmm. And we met monthly. Mm-hmm. For how long?
Probably about 2. It was like 2 years. It was 2 years. It was 2 years of us meeting.
For 2 years, we read all these books, and we decided that in the end, it was something that we needed to bring to the community, because we appreciate not everybody is going to read a whole list of books, but we do have people out there that want to understand, that want to learn, and we just have to engage with them in different ways. And so here we are 4 years later. Mm-hmm. So we read those books for 2 years. And we spent another 2 years trying to summarize them, draft outlines and topics that we think we could follow in a way that connects with us as a people. And so we're grateful to those elders that sat with us and helped us curate this list of books. But the question now is, how do we turn that into community action? And so Roose's Book Club was formed of that. It then turned into a project underneath Future Leaders Bermuda, which is a registered charity working to engage and empower young Bermudians to think critically and to challenge the status quo. And with that merger, we have Roose's Book Club here today, where we're hoping to engage with you as a community on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the best things that came out of that 2 year period for us was it took us from a state of learned helplessness of we know these things, but how do we form plans? How do we form tangible, just tangible things that take us from just knowing this information to then being able to not just do something about it, but then empower others. And so in that 2-year period after we read the books, that's what we spent a lot of time on. It wasn't just about drafting the curriculum. It was about taking this from just a book club to being more than gathering together, reading some books, and having good discussions. It was like, how do we come up with ideas that help to empower others? And
so for those of you listening, we want you to see this as it's a journey. This isn't just a talk show. It's not just a place where we're going to be talking about and venting about issues, but we actually sat and put together a list of books and talking points and discussions and reflection questions. And we're hoping that this is something that you can see as a journey. This is a club that you can be a part of just by listening and engaging. You can read the books with us as we go through them. You can call in and have the discussion with us. But this is really something. It took us 2 years to read the books. It would take us a lot longer to summarize them and really flesh out all of the different points from many of these books. But the point of this is it's an ongoing journey. It's a curriculum. It's a conversation. As you tune in regularly, we hope that in time and through consistency, we'll be able to come to some sort of a common understanding around how did we get here. Mm-hmm. So, Sam, why don't we go through a little bit about what are the books and topics that we're going to be discussing? Mm-hmm. How is this going to carry over as we progress through our Roose's Book Club? And then we can get a little bit into some of the basic foundations of what we're going to be doing, how we want to move forward, and then we can get into today's discussion.
Okay. So to all our listeners out there, this show is going to be seasonal. And this season, we're really delving into the how did we get here, the foundations. And we have sort of like these 3 pressing themes. And it's radical unlearning, radical heritage, and radical contacts. And what we mean by that is it's about really delving into Bermudian society, what's going on, how we got here, what is it that we need to unlearn about what we've been taught with our history, throughout our history, and really trying to reclaim the things that we've lost and to take a look at what we've lost, right? So today's just our introduction. And as we get through the next couple of episodes, these are the themes we're going to be looking at. And we're hoping that with the engagement of our audience and our listeners, that we'll be able to continue this for seasons to come.
Sure. Thank you, Sam. So, let's quickly outline just some of the books that we're going to be covering. Mm-hmm. And this is for those of you out there who don't just want to listen to the show as it comes on. You can also follow on social media at Roose's Book Club on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. Just search at Roose's Book Club or visit our website, futureleaders.bm/Roose's Book Club. You could also go to roosesbookclub.bm. So there's plenty different ways that you can engage with us. For the purpose of this show, what we're going to do today right now is outline very quickly just a list of books for those of you who are out there and actually want to go out and read and get ahead of the discussion. So what's the first book that is on our list, Sam?
The first book is The West and the Rest of Us by Chinwezu.
Yeah.
And this is, he talks about like the 500 years of Western imperialism and how it has exploited not just African societies, but global South. So when we think of the context of Bermuda, we're thinking about Bermuda, mm-hmm. the Caribbean, and other neighbors.
And we're going to come back into that a little bit later on in the show, too, mm-hmm. because that is, we think it's important when you think of the term Sankofa and reaching back to go forward. We really can't analyze Bermuda and the how did we get here today without thinking about our people's history, right? That's mm-hmm. going back to the continent, going back to colonization, going back to imperialism, going back to the founding of Bermuda, our culture, our society as it is today. And so we do start out with the West and the Rest of Us because we have to look back to that 500-year history as the basis and the foundations, but also before that. And I think Chinwezu does a good job at looking at our people and the African context before colonization. What existed before? What sorts of systems and cultural practices broke down that we don't even start with, because we historically just kind of start with slavery, right? And just say, well, that messed everything up. But we don't look at what existed before. So that's the first book we're going to be getting into. Go out and get it, or contact us if you need some help finding it. The other books that we looked at is The Experience of Racism in Bermuda and in Its Wider Context by the late, great Dr. Eva Hodgson. Excellent book which ties it into Bermuda in the modern context today. The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. Black Power, The Politics of Liberation by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton. Black Power in Bermuda by Bermuda's own Keto Swan. They Called Him Roose by Coben Burchell. Is that the last one on the list that we have so far?
And we have Me One.
Me One by the great Paulu Kamaraka himself, who this club is named after. There's a few other books that we had in there as well. Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. And that's just an initial list of some of the books that we covered and went through that form the basis for our discussions. And so when we talk about the different things that we're going to be discussing on Roose's Book Club, some of it is opinion. You know, we're inserting our own insights and our own reflections, right? And we want you to do the same. But it's also a curriculum. So the idea is this is not necessarily my opinion, Simbert's opinion, although we will talk about our own reflections. But really, we're benefiting from the insight of those great academics, some Bermudian even, that we named that came before. They've analyzed this. They've looked at Bermuda. They've looked at everything in its wider context. They've already outlined where we came from, how did we get here. And it's up to us to sort of discuss where we're going after that with the benefit of that informed perspective. So let's talk a little bit just about some of the rules for engagement. You know, how are we going to operate and communicate with each other? What are some of the standards and principles that we're going to live by here at Roose's Book Club? And then we'll get into today's discussion.
So we pretty much have 5 sort of like values. And piggybacking off of what Raj just said, we're education focused. We don't want to just get on here and spew our own rhetoric or our own opinions. Like, we're here to learn. And that's why we've taken the time to read these books. But we want to make that the foundation of understanding what's going on in Bermuda today. So the social political landscape. And we want to make sure that our discussions are based off of research. The second one is that we are nonpartisan, so this is not a show where we're going to be advocating or pushing any one political party. We want to make sure that our show is more based on the community. We are focused on our people. We are focused on making sure that Bermuda benefits as a whole, so we're not going to get into party politics. And we want to make sure that our dialogue is respectful, but that we also have healthy disagreements. It's not about groupthink and making sure that everyone sees things the way we do. And we might not even see eye to eye at some times. And it's okay. It's okay to disagree. We want to make sure that everyone can not just express their opinion and their view, but that we're hearing more than one perspective.
This
and
next
that
one is
leads
really,
to the respectful dialogue.
Yeah,
so we're not coming on here and making sure that everyone's like yelling and screaming. No, we're respecting everyone's opinions.
This next one is a really a favorite of mine. Assume good intent. So, you know, as Simber just said, these discussions can get heated. You know, we know the state of Bermuda today. We talk about party politics. We look at some of the latest occurrences. And the culture, the atmosphere can get very turbulent and aggressive, right? And so it's really important that as we go through these conversations that we're assuming good intent. In all of our interactions, we want to assume that each participant is speaking from a place of sincerity and aiming to contribute positively to our discussions. And I think that's crucial for maintaining a supportive environment where everyone feels safe to express their thoughts and opinions, right? So regardless of where you stand on the political aisle, regardless of what we may think about each other personally or what we know about each other outside of this live show, when you call in, when we engage with each other, we're going to assume that we're working towards the same goal here of fostering a community of informed, reflective, and proactive individuals working together to help make Bermuda better based on an understanding of who we are, where we're going, and how we got here, right? That brings us to the last one, which is community engagement. This is a collaborative space. We encourage you to engage, to ask questions, and to contribute positively to the learning experience. So everyone's voice here is valuable, whether you've read the books, whether you haven't read the books, if you're just tuning in. As long as you care and you adopt these values, educational focus, connecting theory with practice, a nonpartisan approach, respectful dialogue, healthy disagreement, assume good intent, then we're happy for you to engage with us. So as we proceed, let's just remember that our ultimate goal is empowerment through education. We're here to uncover and understand, to connect and reflect, and to grow as a community. And although we do have our talking points and our books, we will still sort of delve into day-to-day discussions and some of the things that are going on today. But as Simbrit said, we're not looking at it from a party politics point of view. We're looking at it from the context of analyzing how we got here and where we are as a people. So we may very well get into some of those hot topics, but we want to focus on what the intent behind that is. And that's not to get into the nitty-gritty of taking one side over the other or descending into some of the nasty atmosphere that we might see when it comes to some of the party politics. We're connecting the theory with the practice.
Exactly. So we didn't quite dive deep enough into it, but I kind of want to circle back for a bit, right, and talk about how we came up with the name of Roose's Book Club. So we are named after Dr. Paulu Kamara-Kafiga, and he was a Bermudian revolutionary. I remember when we were trying to decide what we call the book club, I actually wasn't even aware of who he was. And so part of even creating this book club has been about reintroducing us back to our own heritage and reintroducing us back to our own heroes. Because as we went through our book list, I think about half of our books are locally sourced. And I want you to kind of give your own perspective of, because you were the one who came up with the name, of why you chose him.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that one of the things I'm passionate about is self-determination. I'm not using the word independence alone because I think sometimes we associate that with just a political act of a nation becoming independent and not the substance, right? Roose, Paulu was all about self-sufficiency, self-determination. And that doesn't just mean doing things on your own. It means having your own sense of dignity and approaching things from a community that takes ownership and autonomy and agency over its own future, right? Paulu is somebody who was very big on that. You read Me One, his autobiography. You read They Called Him Roose by Coben Burchell. And you realize that this guy was so underrated. We talk about national heroes and some of the big figures. He's a name that I think 90% of people my age have never heard. And that's insane to me because when you read his autobiography and you realize that Paulu went to the United Nations on Bermuda's independence, he traveled across Africa, Micronesia, he traveled all across the globe. He advised presidents, prime ministers in the wave of the independence movements of the 1960s around the world. And, there's that phrase, that biblical phrase about a man is not without honor, save in his own country. I think Paulu is an example of that because this is a man who traveled the world and advised presidents. And he's not even known in our own community in 21 square miles with 60,000 people. We may have him as a national hero, but when you look at the context of our other national heroes, Paulu and what he did for Bermuda, his dream has yet to be realized. Right? And that wasn't just political independence. It was seeing our community really set the precedent for other nations to follow from an informed community of persons working together and building together. And so, we'll get into his book and some of the things he did. But when you really look at his history and what he contributed, he was a revolutionary person. And I think it was only fitting that if we're talking about building a community of persons that are coming to understand Bermuda with the, in the back of our heads, thought that Bermuda has yet to fully realize its potential and there's a lot more growth to do, that's the person that comes to mind for me because he already laid out the plan. We just haven't read it. That's why we're here.
And that's a perfect segue into talking about like why we're here, like why launch now? What is it about Bermuda's like landscape that really cries out for a platform like ours? And to me, it's very obvious in not even just our politics, because we see a lot of frustration with not even just the current government, but government in general. Even people called into question the type of government that we have under the Westminster system. And you look at how we're struggling with our infrastructure, how we're struggling with cultural identity, how we're struggling with every aspect of society in Bermuda. And you can't help but wonder, where do we go next? Mm-hmm. Like, how do we dig ourselves out of this kind of pitfall that we've been trying to get out for years? And it seems like the hole is getting bigger. And I don't want people to, I think what I want Bermudians to start realizing is that we have the answers right here. Mm-hmm. We use the example of Dr. Kamara Kafego and his book, Me One, but also other figures in our history, both past and present, that have the building blocks, that have the foundation for us to be able to not just empower ourselves to realize our potential, but also how to move forward and maximize on that potential.
It's funny because you're talking about, where we are today and where we're going. And we come back to the theme, right? Those answers are there, but you can't properly answer that question unless you analyze, how did we get here, mm-hmm. right? And that's why that's the theme of today. When we say, how did we get here? Yes, we're talking about how we got here as Roose's book club, but it's in the wider context of how do we get here as a society, Bermuda? And in that bigger picture is, well, how do we get here as a people, right? And that's why we had to go back to those initial books. Mm-hmm. Why now? Well, let's take a moment and just reflect on the state of Bermuda today, right? I think there's a lot of frustration in the community. I think there's a lot of hopelessness. Mm-hmm. I think young Bermudians, we've talked for years now. We're in year 10 and counting of what we call the brain drain of young Bermudians not wanting to return. That's a long historical thing we've talked about, and, we're living it now. I think we're at that end result. Those who were going to leave have left. And it's who's left now, right? You look at some of our bright young stars of the future that we saw growing up. They've left, a lot of them. A lot of our cultural figures. When you look at some of our elders, they've passed and gone on. And so it's very interesting, this state we're in today, where when you look at Bermuda's political context, we've reached a point now where it's almost like we're out of juice. Mm-hmm. And everybody's kind of scrambling, and it's like we're now realizing the results of decisions made prior. And I don't want to limit that to a particular party or political group, because the whole point is that you can't look at just the government today. You can't just look at a political party over the last decade or 20 years or even 30 years or even 40 years. You have to look at it in the context of us as a culture, us as a people, the way that we operate and communicate and deal with each other, mm-hmm. because this is bigger than any one organization, one individual, one leader. We're really talking about the effects of hundreds of years of colonialism, imperialism, isms and schisms that have caused our people to operate and govern and lead or not lead in a particular way. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about how did we get here, it's just a very opportune time to have this discussion, because finally, I think, people are actually looking around and saying, oh, this is pretty bad. We should probably do something about this, and what can we do? Mm-hmm. I don't think we're in denial anymore. I think we were at some point. I don't know.
For sure. I think it was more of the weight of the past was something that people didn't want to have to acknowledge, mm-hmm. because it felt too big and it felt too, I guess, out of their control.
But also, I think we had felt like we moved on from it. When you think to the early 2000s, we were feeling ourselves.
This is true.
We really were like, racism in the past, move on, get over it. Like, I remember that being a thing. Like, we really thought we had arrived.
Yes.
And I think we realize now a lot of that stuff was beneath the surface, and we're feeling the effects because actually we haven't really changed much. And so now we're here at that end result now, and we've already tried the other thing, and we're back to square one in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we're learning now as a community how to be a community again, how to lead again, how to grasp that history that we thought was not so important.
Mm-hmm.
And we're realizing that, oh, wait, the elders are gone now. We haven't read the books. We dismissed this from our education in the sense that we focused on what we think individual success needs to be and what I'm going to do professionally to advance at the expense of who really are we as a people.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're feeling the ramifications of it, and we're looking for answers. That's what I think we're in today. But there's also a lot of anger, a lot of trauma, a lot of hopelessness, and we want to hopefully be part of the other young Bermudians and not so young Bermudians that are out there that are really trying to be that light in a dark period, I would say.
I agree. And that's where I think our themes really kind of come into play, because everyone wants to jump to solutions first. Like what I'm seeing now with the anger and the frustration and the desire to want to do better, people want to just have this quick fix. Mm-hmm. It's just like, oh, we just need to do this. Oh, if we just change political parties. Oh, if we just, and going through these books has really taught me that you have to go back first. Mm-hmm. You have to understand the wider context, because you're gonna miss some of the root issues. And if you're not getting to the root issues and you're just thinking about trimming, the leaves on the tree, the bare leaves, you're gonna end up back at square one, which is what I think also happened. Not even just the fact that we were, feeling ourselves or thought we were in a better position, but people were kind of too busy looking at the outside, or I guess the fruits and the labor of some of the
material.
Exactly. We weren't going deep enough. Mm-hmm. We weren't really asking the questions of how did we end up here? And we also come from sort of like a little bit of a legacy of brushing things off, of trying to, dress up the things that aren't so pretty and thinking that if we spritz a little perfume on it, then it won't stink as bad. Mm-hmm. But we're realizing now that you have to really dig deep. You have to go back to the beginning to figure out not even just what caused these problems, but how they really manifest itself in the open. So how they really show up on the outside.
And so, with that, we present to you Roose's Book Club, right? Mm-hmm. We want to have that real conversation. When you talk about why now, well, with the acknowledgement of what we've just said, we think that space now exists. We feel like now is a good time to have that real talk because people's eyes are opened. People know the state that we're in. We want to do something about it. And we here at Roose's Book Club and at Future Leaders understand that we don't want to just look at the symptoms. We don't just want to look at the quick fixes. It all starts from within. We have to understand ourselves as individuals in the context of our history and where we came from. That will allow us to get a better understanding of our community and where we need to go from here. And I don't think that's a conversation we were willing to have before. I don't think it's something people were open to before. But it certainly is now. When you have persons like Sir John Swan coming out in public and saying criticisms of the current system, and you have people listening to that historically would not have listened to anything you had to say around changing the system, right? When you have opportunities like that, that's when people are really saying, oh, wait, how did we get here? Where are we going? What are we going to do about this? Mm-hmm. And so we're hoping that with those values established that we mentioned earlier, we can facilitate a community of real conversations. But we need your patience. This is not going to be a show where we're going to hop on and churn out a bunch of ideas and quick fixes and then hang up and just vent. This is a journey. It took us 2 years to finish the books. It took us another 2 years to be here to talk to you today. And we're still learning. So we don't want to give you an illusion that we're going to come on here with a big manifesto and a platform. This is a community. We're learning and growing together. We're going to unpack some of the things that we've learned. We're going to reflect and have that discussion with you. And if you stick with us, I'm not going to put a timeline on it, but at some point, maybe we'll have a better understanding collectively of how did we get here. And that'll be a first step to actually saying where are we going next. We're not going to do it backwards. And so with that being said, we're going to head to a break shortly. And when we come back from that break, we'll get into a little bit more about today's discussion, talk a little bit about that first book in the context of Bermuda, how we got here as a society. Anything to add, Sam?
Nope, I think we'll go for a break, and we'll see you guys when we get back.
And we're back with Roose's Book Club. So just before the break, we mentioned to you that Roose's Book Club is a social, cultural, and political unit of Future Leaders Bermuda to engage with all of us in Bermuda, particularly young Bermudians and interested residents, to promote a common understanding, a national consciousness, foster civic engagement, and raise awareness of Bermuda's history regarding nation building and empowerment. So we outlined to you some of the books that we were covering. The theme today is, how did we get here? And we're going to, for the rest of this conversation, just touch base on that first book that we looked at, which we encourage you to go out and get. It's called The West and the Rest of Us, White Predators, Black Slavers, and the African Elite by Chinwezu.
And this book examines 500 years of Western expansion and imperialism in Africa, colonial rule and policy, African complacency, and the contemporary consequences of colonial oppression and betrayal.
I know that's a bit of a mouthful. What really stands out to me and why I had to read that full title is, when we talk about the history, when we talk about Bermuda, when you talk about enslavement, we talk about the white side, we talk about the enslavement side, but this book also goes into the African elite. And Simba just mentioned African complicity. It's interesting because that's something that we don't touch on as much. How have we as a people, how is our leadership, how have the ways in which we've governed ourselves also contributed to our own oppression? So I'm going to read a quote. It's in the foreword of this book, The West and the Rest of Us. I just want us to unpack it a little bit. Chinwezu starts the book by saying, "I should begin by noting that this is not a work of protest. Rather, it is a critical investigation into the purposes and styles of Western imperialist expansion during the past 500 years. It is also an investigation from the context of that expansion into the man-made causes of Africa's backwardness. It is unnecessary to add any more to our mountain of lamentations. It is too late for us, the imperialized, to weep upon the shoulders of those who have brought about our oppression for sympathy toward our plight. We need, rather, to understand our past defeats if we want to avoid the deadly shocks our future seems to be holding in ambush for us. And to do so, it is imperative that we revise our understanding of the history of which we are products." Simber, what does that mean to you?
I think one of the points that stands out to me in this book, and it really hit me when I read it, is that it's not enough to talk bad about colonialism. Like, it's not enough to just condemn it, because colonialism goes beyond ownership in its name. It's more than just a singular act of conquering. It's an entire system that exploits not just the people that it has conquered, but it exploits every aspect of those people. And so we have to look at what was disrupted. We have to look at what was changed, especially because it was done without keeping its own people in mind. Mm-hmm. It exploited without the care or regard of the people that it left behind, and how it would affect generations to come.
So I want to make a point here that Chinwezu mentions in the book. He talks about the particular way in which colonialism had its impact. And, if we read the book, we'll get into some of the specific examples and causes. That's much too long for us to cover in just this show today. But I want us to keep one thing in mind. What he said in that book was colonialism sort of took its toll. The way that it happened in three different areas. he talks about economic, political, and the cultural. So I'm just going to break that down a little bit more, right? So the three ways in which colonialism had its impact. The economic/financial, right? So that's the way that we allocate resources, the way we finance ourselves, the way that as a community we operate in the context of resources, right? Then there's the political. He talks about the system, right? The system of government, the system of leadership, the ways in which leaders are selected, the ways in which we govern ourselves, right? And then the third way was the social cultural. That's the way in which we interact with each other as a people. What are our traditions? What's our history? What are the norms and rules that we set as a people that help promote some level of stability? So when we talk about the West and the rest of us, if we had to summarize this book, he's looking at that 500-year history, not just from the Western context, but how did it impact us as a people? And when we look at society and Bermuda today and we ask ourselves, how did we get here? I think we need to look at it from that context. How did we get here economically? How did we get here politically? How did we get here socially and culturally as a people? I think that's a good framework for those of you who are going to go out and get this book and read it, and for those of you who are listening and engaging with us. When we look at the big thing that happened, the great disaster, the colonialism, the enslavement, look at it in the context of those three realms of society and the ways it impacts your life.
And I remember when we talk about how it relates to Bermuda, because I know a lot of times people get stuck on the fact that Bermuda did not have the same, I guess, impact or outcomes as like African societies where, you know, people were already here. We even like to refer to ourselves as like not having a culture or not having the same roots as even other Caribbean islands. But I think that if we want to be really honest with ourselves, when we look at Bermuda in those three contexts of the political, of the environmental, of the cultural, like we can clearly see how we've been affected by colonialism. And it's time to kind of really start looking at colonialism in that impact, in the way that it impacted us. Because I think that even when we talk about solutions for Bermuda and how to get ourselves out of this sort of sinkhole that we're in, or how we want to even move forward and where we want to have impact for our future, we don't like to have not even just the conversations, but we don't like to have the viewpoint that we suffered in the same way that these other parts of the world did.
I think that goes back to the illusion of our development. And I call it the illusion because, I mean, don't get me wrong, right? I just came back from St. Kitts. I've been to St. Lucia. I've been to some of the other islands. And, you know, it's no secret that materially, right, Bermuda is a very special place. We've done very well in the last couple decades economically as a country, right, as a company, as a government. But when you really look at development and what it means for a culture and a people, we've ignored the impact that colonialism has had on us because of the fact that we've had such material wealth, right? And so it's very interesting to me when we look at Chinwezu's book, because he says it's not just enough to condemn colonialism, imperialism, and racism, but we have to measure our strengths and weaknesses and unify to fight the battle of development. So when you talk about that development, they're talking about, you know, as a society, as a culture, you know, and that's where we have to ask the question, have we really developed? We may have these material possessions, you know, we have jobs, we have international business, but as a culture, as a people, have we really developed? In that respect, I would argue that some of these other Caribbean islands have actually surpassed us in development. And we were under this illusion in the early 2000s because we were in our economic prime. But now I think as the gloves have come off and the curtains have fallen, we're looking around and we realize that our community is actually very broken. It's very damaged. And we need to understand how we got here.
And I think for me, some areas, when we talk about Bermuda, some areas that kind of stand out to me is that we're a country that's never had control over our government. Because even though we say we're self-governed, is it really autonomy if we have to ask permission? And we know that one of the biggest areas that we're really starting to suffer with is our education system. And it's an education system that neglects our history. It promotes careers for economic growth only in a certain sector, while ignoring careers that allow for a balanced workforce, which we now know is starting to really suffer. And then we have a culture that's only praised and promoted when it can be exploited for profit. So
that's deep.
We're having real conversations, right?
Yeah. And the other thing, when we talk about, you mentioned having control of our own government, I'm going to take it a step further, right? That's still talking about, when you talk about independence and things like that, that's still talking about within the current Westminster system.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm saying I'm avoiding just sticking to that word of independence, because that still puts us in a particular box when we talk about it. We're not just talking about controlling the system that was designed and set up for us to be controlled, right? When we look at Chinwezu's book, he goes into systems that predate Westminster. He talks about the ways that societies established agreement by consensus and based on common values and understandings, and even the ways that wars were conducted were different in many African societies. There was a different level of respect for life, for dignity. And so that's why when we say, we're not going to get too deep into party politics, it's very easy to get sucked into the day-to-day happenings of what is this government doing with this particular policy, which is important, but we have to zoom out further and say, let's even go beyond the Westminster system. When we talk about not having control over this system, why this system, right? Altogether to begin with, So we're not advocating for one or the other right now, but we are unpacking and having that conversation to say, well, let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's look at the impact of this on the political, the cultural, and the economic.
Mm-hmm. And in a few minutes, we're going to open up the airways so people can call in and give their opinion. But kind of want to start also addressing the fact that one of the things that Chinwezu does in his book is he decenters this historical context from that European view as well. And he really takes it to more of an Afrocentric view. And what I appreciate about that is that you really kind of get the sense that he is talking about what is it that we need as a people for our people. We are so used to looking at ourselves through a lens that has never been for us. It doesn't take into account our needs. It doesn't take into account our history. It doesn't take into account any of our own perspectives or lived experience. And so when we talk about these systems that we find ourselves in, part of the reason why it doesn't work is because it was never designed for us in the first place.
And we seem to ignore that, in the meantime, for those of you who want to call in and get involved in the discussion, the number is 297-1075. We're engaging in a discussion and a reflection around how did we get here? What does it mean to be here? What does that mean in the context of Bermuda as a people? You're welcome to call in and engage. But I want to touch on your point, Simbrit, when we talk about Chinwezu decentering that European perspective, because even when he talks about World War I and World War II, right? Mm-hmm. Like, growing up, I was taught somebody in Europe got shot, it had to do with some royalty, and it sparked this whole global war, right? It just never made sense to me. And Chinwezu details how really a lot of World War I and World War II was about the imperial powers shifting between that scramble for resources in Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And the world, really. Because up until that point, there had still been land to be conquered, right? When you talk about Columbus and exploring and all of that, to Europe, not the entire world had not yet been discovered. But when you come to World War I and II, right, that's when it becomes scarce in terms of this scramble for resources, this scramble for possessions. Mm-hmm. And so these European powers start to battle, right, and conflict with each other. When you couple that with the fact that colonialism at that time was about extraction and taking resources, right, which they then used to fuel the Industrial Revolution, which then led to machinery, etc. Mm-hmm. He talks about that shift from World War I and World War II and how after that colonialism was different. It wasn't just about extraction of resources. Mm-hmm. Once they had that Industrial Revolution, they created products, right, and machinery, and they now needed a market. They now needed to sell those resources. So you look at India, and they went for spices, right, that turned into all those industrial products being made in Europe now needing to be sold. And so the colonized, right, the oppressed, went from resources to be extracted to consumers. And it's very interesting when you look at that in the context of Bermuda being that place that stores wealth, being that offshoot of England, the empire, that international business center. You know, that's just one example that Chinwezu gets into around that changing nature of colonialism.
And I like one of the quotes here. It says, the British established themselves over India, not merely to control trade or to displace narratives and to settle their land, but to rule them and to reorganize and exploit their toil for the benefit of industrial Britain.
Yeah, it's very interesting, you know, because we weren't taught history in that way. And it gets even more complicated when you think about what really happened after World War II. That's when you had that wave of independence movements across the world. And that's because, according to Chinwezu, a lot of those colonies realized that Europe had been weakened. So with all of the battles that took place in World War I and World War II, in the aftermath of that, you had a bit of a new world order where the power had shifted. And so a lot of those countries then sought to assert, the colonies themselves sought to assert their independence and their dominance. And that's obviously a book that Bermuda missed. The context was a bit different. We hadn't even had a black government at the time. But that's just one example of how Chinwezu really gets deep into changing that narrative around how we got here, the history. And that's just the example of World War II. It doesn't get into some of the other things that happened throughout the 500 years of colonialism and the history, right?
Yeah.
So that's just a taste.
And to give even more of a taste, it segues a little bit into the concept of freedom. And we'll get into that next week. But as we wrap up our show, our very first show for today, we kind of want to leave our audience with not only just the questions that we put forward, but also everything that we talked about. And this is a part of the radical unlearning phase. And we went through it. I remember when we read this book and seeing history for the first time from an Afrocentric perspective, it really, really put into place some of those missing pieces of like, oh, now I'm understanding where some of these deeper issues kind of really took root.
Yeah, and so, you know, as we talk about today's takeaways, right, this was just the introduction, right? We outlined to you a little bit around the foundations and the origins of Roose's book club, and we even got to dabble a little bit into that first book, The West and the Rest of Us by Chinwezu. And so we want to leave you with some key reflections and takeaways, right? One is we have to start by demanding that history is explained from a viewpoint that is relevant and something that we connect with to our people, right? We can't be afraid to question the so-called experts. You know, growing up, I was taught history in a certain way. We were all taught certain narratives. We have to question those and really connect them with us. Because if you're learning about things like World War II or a particular date or something that happened in isolation and you're not connecting it with that wider context, you're not going to understand how one thing led to another, which then led us here. And so one key takeaway is definitely we have to start questioning that history. I know that persons in education will suggest that it is being taught. I'm not disputing that education and our history is being put, it has been put into the schools, and we've made a lot of headway in terms of the growth. But I still think we need to go back over it, and we need to unpack it a little bit more. That's not something that's just going to be done in the schools. It's something that has to happen in our community spaces. It's something that our leaders and our elders may not even be aware of, right? It's something that as we go through these books, we have to question ourselves and say, can we look at this from another perspective? And this time with a view to not just knowing that we were conquered and that there was slavery, etc., but the how and the why. What things led to something else? What other takeaways do we have for today?
I think another takeaway is that establishing self-determination it goes beyond the independence. It goes beyond just looking at things from a strictly political or strictly even economic stance. It is encompassing of everything of what it means to be your own people. It includes your culture, it includes your history. And so self-determination, not just independence, is the key to achieving our political and cultural sovereignty and to be able to develop not just looking at where we are today, but as we look towards the future.
Brilliant. So, that was just a bit of a summary of the start. That was the foreword of Chinwezu's book. It doesn't get into the hundreds of pages that come after. And that's something that we want to encourage you to do. The West and the Rest of Us by Chinwezu, using that as a basis to ask ourselves the question, how did we get here? How did we get here in Bermuda today? How did we get here as a people? How do we get here where we feel like there's a need to create this space and foster community where we're discussing these things? And have they been discussed before? And if not, why not? And if they have been discussed, why are we only talking about it now when we're at a state in society where we feel like we're at the bottom and things are really looking hopeless, and we're looking for a new sense of direction? So I'll let Siam give us a bit of an outline and a recap around what comes next. We'll read over those other books that we want you to pick up. You have a little bit of time before our next show, and then we'll wrap up for the day.
Okay, so we are going to be back in another 2 weeks. So August 17th.
July
17th. We'll be back here same time, 1 to 2 p.m. on Hott 107.5. And our theme will be Radical Unlearning. We'll dive a little bit deeper into Chinwezu's book, The West and the Rest of Us. And we want to encourage you guys to follow us on social media at Roose's Book Club. And also, we want to plug in our Future Leaders here. So Future Leaders Bermuda on social platforms as well. Check us out on our website at www.futureleaders.com/Roose's Book Club to not just learn more about the club, but you can also reach out to us if you need some help with getting the books, obtaining the books. And we will see you guys back here in 2 more weeks.
So thanks again for listening. That's futureleaders.pm/Roose's Book Club. Catch us on socials at Roose's Book Club. We're looking forward to connecting with you. This is show 1 of what we hope are many. Engage with us, follow us online, pick up the books, and let's get this conversation going.